For years, a town's police officers operated without consequence. Every complaint against them vanished. Every investigation stopped before it could start. They held the neighborhood in a chokehold, certain no one could challenge their power, until they made the mistake of attacking Jamal Cross and his business. They walked in expecting easy compliance, another man too afraid to fight back, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jamal Cross wasn't just a store owner, he was Delta Force. He had spent years dismantling criminal networks, taking down men who thought they were above the rules. He had fought in places where corruption ran deep, where the only way to win was to burn the system down. The officers believed their badges made them untouchable, but their shield wouldn't protect them from what was coming. Because Jamal wasn't just going to fight back, he was going to end them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The late afternoon sun painted the storefront in a deep amber glow, streaking through the dust that swirled in the warm air. Jamal Cross leaned against the counter of Cross Spirits and Fine Liquor, watching the last of his regulars trickle in before the evening rush. He hadn't always imagined himself owning a liquor store. 10 years ago, his world had been battlefields and classified missions, his days spent moving through places where men spoke in hushed voices, and danger was an unspoken certainty. The military had given him purpose, discipline, and a skill set that most people couldn't begin to understand. But war didn't last forever. Now, his life was different, calmer, quieter, though never without its own kind of struggle. The liquor store was his, a small but steady business nestled in a part of the city that had been changing too fast for its own good. The neighborhood had once been a place where people looked out for one another, but now it was being pushed under, piece by piece, by real estate developers and quiet deals made in back rooms. Jamal had never been the kind of man to roll over and let people take what belonged to him, though. That part of him, the part that had survived war zones and impossible missions, hadn't faded with time. The bell above the door jingled, and he glanced up as Mrs. Wilkins, one of his longest customers, shuffled toward the counter with a small bottle of peach brandy cradled in her hands. "Evenin', baby," she greeted with a warm smile, placing the bottle down. "I see you still haven't fixed that flickering light outside. Gonna give somebody a seizure." Jamal smirked, glancing toward the buzzing fluorescent fixture near the entrance. "I keep meaning to. Just hasn't made it to the top of my list yet." She gave him a look that told him she didn't believe that for a second. But she didn't push. As he bagged her purchase, the bell rang again. This time, the air in the store shifted slightly. Jamal didn't need to turn to know trouble had walked in. He moved slowly, casually, placing Mrs. Wilkins's receipt in the bag before lifting his gaze to the two men standing just inside the entrance. Sergeant Cole Bishop, Officer Ethan Grady. They weren't here for liquor. Mrs. Wilkins, blissfully unaware, gathered her bag and gave Jamal a soft pat on the arm. "You stay safe now, you hear?" Jamal nodded, offering her a reassuring smile as she made her way past the officers, who didn't bother stepping aside. She had to squeeze between them, an unspoken act of power and disrespect, before she disappeared out onto the sidewalk. The door jingled shut behind her. Bishop took his time surveying the store before his gaze settled on Jamal. He had the look of a man who believed he owned every room he stepped into. Broad-shouldered, confident in the way men are when they've never had to fear consequences. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a perfect gleam. Grady, on the other hand, was younger, cockier, the kind of man who had something to prove. Jamal didn't flinch as Grady strolled toward the shelves, casually running his fingers along a row of whiskey bottles like a man walking through his own home. He picked one up, turning it over in his hands. "Didn't expect a place like this to have real liquor," Grady muttered, turning the bottle over. "Figured it'd be more of that cheap corner store garbage. The kind y'all like." Jamal didn't respond. Bishop stepped forward, resting his elbows on the counter like they were old friends. "Relax, Cross. We're just doing our rounds, checking in on businesses in the neighborhood. City's making some changes to keep things running smoothly. New rules, new expectations." Jamal raised a brow. "New rules?" Bishop nodded. See? We're working hard to keep order in this part of town. We make sure everything stays nice and safe. No trouble. No unnecessary headaches. But, of course, all that takes effort. And effort costs money. Grady made a noise in his throat, shaking his head. A lot of these places got real lucky, getting to stick around at all. Some folks just don't know how to appreciate that. His eyes flickered toward the black-owned business sticker near the register before giving Jamal a smirk. Permits are getting real strict these days, Grady continued. Gotta be careful with those health codes. Can't have businesses letting things get too unsanitary. He glanced at the floor, the shelves, like he was looking for something wrong. Not saying there's a problem, but city officials might not see it that way. Jamal understood exactly what they were saying. Protection tax, he said flatly. Bishop gave him a small smile, as if amused by the term. Call it what you want, but cooperation? That makes things easier for everybody. Pay a small monthly fee and we make sure everything stays in order. That liquor license of yours won't run into any issues. Health inspections? Smooth as can be. And if, say, someone decided to try and break in here? Well, we'd be the first ones on the scene. Jamal's fingers curled slightly against the countertop, but his expression remained unreadable. And if I don't? Bishop let out a slow, measured breath, shaking his head. Then you take a risk. Grady chuckled. A big risk. We had to shut down a couple places last month. Unfortunate paperwork issues. And some of these neighborhoods, they get real unpredictable when the wrong people start hanging around. He glanced toward the front door. A lot of folks ain't cut out for running a business. Place like this? Could be a whole different shop by next year. Something cleaner, classier. Jamal stayed silent for a long moment, letting the weight of their words settle in the air. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached for the register and hit the cash drawer shut, without ringing anything up. Bishop's smirk faltered slightly. Jamal folded his arms over his chest. I'll pass. Silence. Grady exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head like he'd expected this. Man's making things difficult for himself, he muttered. Bishop straightened his stance, nodding once, as if confirming something in his head. Grady sighed and held up the whiskey bottle he'd been eyeing, giving it one last look before letting it slip from his hand. The glass shattered against the floor, sending sharp echoes through the store. The smell of alcohol spilled into the air immediately, strong and deliberate. Neither of them flinched. Bishop took a slow step backward, adjusting his cuffs as he turned toward the door. You're gonna regret that, Cross, he said smoothly. We'll be back. The bell jingled again as they walked out. Jamal stayed still, his eyes on the dark liquid seeping between the floor tiles, the scent sharp, unmistakable. This wasn't an offer. It was a promise, and the next time they came back, they wouldn't be asking. Jamal locked up just after midnight, pulling the metal shutter down over the storefront, securing the entrance with the heavy padlock. The city never truly slept, but the streets were quiet enough. The occasional passing car sending beams of light stretching across the sidewalk. He stood for a moment, listening, watching, letting the night settle around him. Something in his gut was off. Not fear, not paranoia. He knew the difference. This was something heavier. A weight pressing against his ribs, telling him he should have been ready for what was coming next. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head at himself. He had spent years in places where instincts were the only thing that kept a man breathing. But this was different. This was home, or at least, it was supposed to be. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, the liquor store shrinking in the rearview mirror. By morning, everything had changed. When he returned just after dawn, the damage was the first thing he saw. The front window was shattered, glass littering the sidewalk in uneven chunks, crunching under his boots as he stepped forward. Deep gouges ran across the metal shutter, like someone had taken a knife or a crowbar to it, leaving jagged streaks behind. The old neon sign flickered above the door, struggling against the daylight. Jamal didn't move at first, just let the scene settle in front of him. The air was still, the city barely waking up, But there was a hush to the street. People had seen. They had walked by, maybe slowed for a second, maybe even thought about calling someone before deciding it wasn't their business. He exhaled slowly and reached for his keys. The lock was broken, the metal twisted where it had been forced open. He pushed the door inward, the hinges creaking, the scent of spilled liquor hitting him first. Bottles had been smashed, their contents seeping into the wooden floors, soaking into the shelves. Cigars from the display case were scattered across the counter, some stomped out, some left untouched. The cash register was wide open, but nothing had been taken. Not a robbery. That much was clear. Jamal stepped inside, his boots careful over the debris. He had seen plenty of messes in his lifetime, but this was deliberate. It wasn't just about destruction, it was a message. His stomach turned as he spotted something out of place near the base of the shelves, partially hidden beneath the wreckage. A small plastic bag, torn at the edges, white powder clinging to its surface. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. They had been inside, and they had left him something to find. A slow inhale, measured and even, his mind already running through the next steps. They would show up soon. Maybe a patrol car just happening to drive by. Maybe someone responding to a concerned citizen's call. They would step inside, glance at the damage, pretend to care, and then they'd find it. Right there, in plain sight. Jamal clenched his jaw, forcing his shoulders to stay loose, keeping his pulse steady. He had seen plenty of setups before, just never one with his name on it. His hands curled into fists at his sides. They wanted him out, and if he wasn't going to leave willingly, they would make sure he didn't have a choice. Jamal had barely finished sweeping up the broken glass when the first squad car pulled up, the low hum of the engine settling into the quiet morning like a slow-moving storm. The sound was deliberate, an announcement of their presence meant to be felt before it was fully seen. A second car followed, rolling in smoothly, its tires pressing against the curb in an unspoken claim of control. Then came a third, sealing off the street in a way that made it clear this was not some casual patrol. He had expected them. The sun had barely risen, and the neighborhood was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes, but already people were watching. A few shop owners stood behind their glass windows, their gazes cautious, calculating. A man walking his dog slowed his pace, eyes flicking toward the commotion before deciding it was safer to keep moving. The weight of their stares pressed into the air, not loud, not overt, but present. No one wanted to be involved, but no one could look away either. The driver's door opened first, followed by the sound of boots scraping against the pavement. Bishop stepped out, his uniform crisp, his movements as unhurried as ever, as if he had all the time in the world. His face carried that same unreadable expression, a practiced neutrality that masked something far more dangerous beneath. The way his gaze swept over the damage, the shattered window, the boarded-up glass, the fresh marks where the spray paint had been scrubbed away, told Jamal everything he needed to know. Grady followed closely behind, his movements sharper, more agitated, the faint bruising along his jaw from their last encounter still lingering like a reminder he hadn't forgotten. Unlike Bishop, he wasn't trying to hide anything. His anger sat just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to spill over. Two more officers climbed out of the second squad car, positioning themselves near the storefront in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't casual either. Their presence wasn't necessary, not for what this was supposed to be. But that was the point. Jamal exhaled through his nose, fingers unconsciously tightening around the broom handle before forcing himself to let go. They weren't here to talk. Bishop approached first, stepping over the scattered bits of broken glass with the same ease as someone strolling through a park. His eyes flicked briefly to the mess before settling back on Jamal. He let the silence stretch just long enough before speaking, his tone calm, conversational, like they were just two men discussing business. Busy morning. Jamal didn't rise to it. He kept his grip loose as he leaned the broom against the counter, meeting Bishop's gaze without hesitation. Yeah, you could say that. Bishop exhaled slowly, a faint nod accompanying his next words. Funny thing. We got an anonymous tip about this place. Said there's been some suspicious activity going on here. That sound about right to you? Jamal didn't respond, didn't shift, didn't blink. Bishop let the silence settle for a moment before tilting his head slightly toward one of the officers behind him. Miller, why don't you take a look inside, just to be sure? Miller, a stocky officer with a scar cutting along his chin, stepped forward, already unhooking the latch on his holster like he was anticipating resistance. You got a warrant for this? Jamal asked, his voice level, betraying nothing. Bishop gave him a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Why would we need one? You got nothing to hide, right? Jamal exhaled sharply, shaking his head once in quiet frustration before stepping aside. It wouldn't have mattered what he said. They were going in regardless. He had seen this before. Miller and the other officer moved through the store with the kind of controlled carelessness that wasn't about searching, but about disrupting. They knocked over bottles that didn't need to be knocked over, shifted shelves that didn't need adjusting. It wasn't an investigation. It was a performance. Jamal leaned against the counter, waiting. It didn't take long. Well, well, Miller called from the back, his voice carrying an exaggerated sense of amusement. Looks like we got ourselves a little problem here. Bishop turned, raising an eyebrow in mock curiosity before nodding toward the rear of the store. Let's take a walk. Jamal didn't move right away. Grady stepped in closer, his stare sharp, his posture radiating the anticipation of someone itching for an excuse. With a slow inhale, Jamal pushed off the counter and followed them to the back. Miller stood near the storage room, holding a small plastic bag between two fingers, turning it just enough for the light to catch on the powder inside. The smirk he wore was mild, unimpressed, the look of a man who had played this game many times before. Bishop took the bag, rolling it between his fingers as he turned back to Jamal. See, this is what I don't get. A man like you, business owner, veteran, why go and mess up your life over something so simple? Jamal's expression remained unreadable. Bishop sighed, shaking his head in feigned disappointment before slipping the bag into his pocket like it was just another piece of evidence in a long list of cases he had solved. Now, the way I see it, you've got a few options. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. 1, we take you downtown, book you on possession with intent to distribute. You know what that means, don't you? Store shut down, entire investigation opened up. Probably find more if we look hard enough. Lot of guys inside would love to hear about your time in the service. Grady let out a quiet chuckle behind him, shaking his head. Bishop held up a hand before continuing, as if to soften the blow. Or maybe this was just a mistake. Paperwork gets lost. Evidence gets misplaced. And everything goes back to normal. Jamal's expression didn't change. And what's that cost? Bishop smiled, small and knowing. Call it an investment, one that keeps you in business, one that makes sure nights like last night don't happen again. Jamal let the words settle. Let the game play out exactly the way they wanted it to. Then he shook his head once. Bishop sighed, pressing his lips together as though truly disappointed. See? I was hoping you'd be smarter about this. Grady stepped forward, the restrained energy in his movements barely contained. You really think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Some righteous man standing up to the big bad cops? He scoffed, shaking his head. You ain't got nobody watching your back. Nobody's coming to save you. So why make it harder than it needs to be? Jamal exhaled through his nose, voice steady. I don't pay for things that don't have value. The tension shifted in an instant. Grady's smirk vanished. His hands flexed at his sides, his jaw tightening just slightly. Bishop adjusted his cuffs, letting the silence breathe for a moment before turning toward the exit. Let's clear out. Jamal knew better than to believe it was over. Grady lingered, his eyes sharp, his body tense, the kind of posture that screamed unfinished business. His fingers twitched slightly before he finally reached. Before Jamal could react, Grady grabbed a bottle off the nearest shelf, one of the heavier whiskey bottles, and turned back sharply. The glass caught the light just for a second, before it came swinging straight for Jamal's face. Jamal barely ducked in time. The bottle shattered against the counter, shards flying, liquid splattering across the floor. Bishop let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You really shouldn't have done that, Cross." Jamal wiped the whiskey from his face, his muscles tightening, his stance shifting instinctively into something controlled. The fight had just begun. Jamal barely had time to move before Grady came at him again. The whiskey bottle had missed his head by inches, shattering against the counter and sending glass flying across the floor. The scent of alcohol filled the air instantly, thick and sharp. But Jamal didn't have time to focus on it because Grady was already swinging again, this time with his fists. Jamal slipped to the side, letting the punch glance off his shoulder instead of taking it full force. Grady was strong, but he wasn't precise. He was fueled by anger, by the need to prove something, and Jamal had seen plenty of men like that before. The ones who hit first and thought later. The ones who never expected the fight to come back at them. Jamal didn't hesitate. He countered immediately, driving his elbow into Grady's ribs with enough force to make him grunt and stumble back a step. It wasn't enough to put him down, but it was enough to make him think twice about rushing in blind. For a second, everything slowed. The other officers stood still, their eyes flicking between Grady and Jamal, calculating, reassessing. Then Bishop stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, his expression cold, controlled. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "That's how it's gonna be, then." And just like that, they all moved at once. Jamal barely had time to raise his arms before Bishop's baton came swinging. He deflected the first hit, catching the impact on his forearm instead of his ribs, but the force still sent a sharp ache through his bones. Another officer grabbed him from the side, trying to wrestle him down, but Jamal planted his feet and twisted, sending the man off balance. A fist slammed into his gut. Jamal gritted his teeth as pain tore through his stomach, but he refused to fold. He had been hit harder before, had been through worse, and he wasn't about to go down that easy. He reacted instinctively, using the opening to ram his shoulder into Grady's chest, driving him backward into the nearest shelf. Bottles crashed to the floor around them, liquor spilling across the tiles. But Jamal didn't stop moving. Another officer came at him from behind, trying to grab him by the collar. Jamal spun, driving his elbow back into the man's jaw, making his head snap to the side. Then Bishop was there again. The baton swung high this time, aiming for his temple. Jamal ducked just in time, feeling the air shift as the weapon missed by mere inches. He surged forward, catching Bishop by the wrist, using his own momentum against him to yank him forward. Bishop barely stumbled. He was stronger than the others, steadier. He planted his feet, twisted his body, and slammed his knee into Jamal's ribs. The pain exploded through him instantly. His vision blurred for a second, his lungs locking up, his breath stolen from his chest. That was all they needed. Grady was back, fueled by rage and humiliation, driving his fist straight into Jamal's face. The hit sent him staggering, his back crashing against the counter, and then they were all on him. Fists, batons, boots slamming into his ribs, his arms, his back. Jamal dropped to one knee, his vision flickering between sharp and hazy, his body screaming at him to stay down. But he wasn't built for that. He forced himself to breathe through the pain, to ignore the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, to push past the agony burning through his ribs. They thought they had him. They thought they had won. Jamal let them believe it for half a second. Then he moved. He surged forward, ignoring the way his body protested, ignoring the sharp stab in his side where he was sure something had cracked. His hands shot out, grabbing the nearest officer, Miller, by the collar and yanking him down. The force of it threw Miller off balance, sending him crashing against the floor. Bishop moved in to strike again, but Jamal was already twisting away from the next baton swing, shifting just enough to avoid taking the hit full force. Instead, he caught the officer's wrist, pulled him in close, and sent a sharp knee into his stomach. The man folded instantly, gasping as he stumbled back. Grady lunged at him from the side, trying to tackle him, but Jamal was faster. He sidestepped just in time, grabbing Grady's arm and using his own momentum to send him flying into the counter. Bottles crashed. Glass shattered. Grady groaned as he tried to push himself up, but Jamal didn't give him the chance. He grabbed him by the back of the shirt, spun him around, and drove his fist straight into his face. Grady crumpled. One down. The others weren't done yet. Jamal turned just as Miller rushed him again. Baton raised. He had no time to dodge, no space to counter. The hit landed hard against his shoulder. His entire arm went numb from the impact, pain radiating through his body like fire. Jamal gritted his teeth, forcing himself to push through it, to stay standing. He knew he was outnumbered, knew he was already running on borrowed time, but that didn't mean he was going to roll over and let them finish him. He shifted his stance, steadied his breathing, prepared for the next wave. Bishop wiped blood from the corner of his mouth, his eyes narrowing as he stepped forward again. Still standing, he muttered, almost like he was impressed. Jamal exhaled, rolling his shoulders, despite the pain lancing through his ribs. "Takes more than a bunch of cowards to put me down." The moment the words left his mouth, Bishop's expression darkened. Grady, still dazed, groaned from the floor, one hand pressed against his bleeding lip. Miller spit onto the ground, shaking off the tension in his hands. They weren't finished. Not yet. Jamal flexed his fingers, his body aching, his vision blurred at the edges, but his focus razor-sharp. Jamal could taste blood in his mouth, his ribs a tight, burning mess with every breath he took. But he wasn't done yet. His body ached, his muscles screamed, but the moment he stopped moving was the moment they finished him. He had fought against worse odds before, had survived worse fights, and he wasn't about to let a pack of corrupt cops be the ones to put him down. Bishop adjusted his stance, shifting his grip on the baton, his face void of any amusement now. The patience was gone. The arrogance had faded. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was personal. Grady, still on the ground, coughed as he spat out blood, one hand clutching his face where Jamal's fist had left its mark. Miller cracked his knuckles, flexing his fingers like he was warming up for another round. The fourth officer, a wiry man with sharp features, had his hand hovering too close to his holster, like he was debating whether or not to escalate this beyond fists and batons. Jamal took all of it in. He saw the way they moved, how they adjusted, how they reacted. They still saw him as just another man, someone they could beat into submission, someone who should have known better than to fight back, but they didn't know who they were really fighting. Bishop moved first, closing the distance fast, the baton swinging in a sharp arc meant to take Jamal's legs out from under him. Jamal didn't try to block it. He let the momentum come, shifting his weight at the last second to roll with the strike, absorbing just enough of the impact to keep himself steady. As soon as his feet found solid ground again, he launched forward, driving his shoulder into Bishop's chest with the full force of his body weight. The older cop stumbled, his balance thrown, but he recovered fast. Too fast for Jamal to capitalize. Miller came in from the side, swinging his fist in a wide arc. Jamal saw it coming, ducked under it, and in the same motion, sent a sharp knee straight into the man's gut. Miller choked on his breath, doubling over, and Jamal finished it with a hard elbow to the back of his head. Miller collapsed to the ground, groaning, his hands clawing at the pavement. Another one down, but the fight wasn't over. Bishop had recovered, and this time, he didn't come alone. Grady, fueled by nothing but rage, surged forward, grabbing Jamal by the collar of his shirt and trying to yank him off balance. Jamal twisted into the motion, forcing Grady's own strength against him, and in one sharp movement, he hooked his leg around the younger officer's ankle and took him down hard. Grady hit the ground with a grunt, his head bouncing off the pavement. Jamal barely had time to breathe before Bishop was there again, his baton crashing into the back of his shoulder. The pain tore through him, sharp and immediate, but he didn't let it stop him. He turned with the hit, letting the impact roll off as best as he could, and before Bishop could swing again, Jamal struck first. He grabbed the older officer's wrist, forcing the baton away, and in one swift motion, he twisted Bishop's arm behind his back, forcing him into a brutal hold. Bishop grunted, trying to yank himself free, but Jamal didn't let up. He drove his knee into the man's back, hard, forcing him further down. The wiry officer panicked. Jamal saw it in his eyes before he even moved. His hand went to his gun. Jamal acted without thinking. He released Bishop and surged toward the officer before the gun could clear the holster. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it sharply, and forced the weapon out of his grip. The officer shouted in pain, stumbling backward, but Jamal didn't stop there. He used the momentum to slam his fist into the cop's jaw, sending him sprawling against the squad car. The gun clattered to the pavement. Jamal didn't reach for it. He knew better. The second his hand touched that weapon, this would turn into something else entirely. But Grady didn't see it that way. He was back on his feet, wild-eyed and unhinged, and before Jamal could react, he was reaching for his own gun. Jamal moved first. He grabbed Grady's wrist, yanked him forward, and with the last bit of strength he had, he drove his elbow into the younger cop's throat. The hit landed clean, brutal, precise. Grady choked, gasping as his body seized up. He collapsed, clutching his throat, his breath ragged, wheezing, struggling. For a moment, everything stopped. The other officers stared. Jamal could feel the shift in the air. The moment they realized just how bad this had gotten, Grady wasn't just hurt. He was barely breathing. Bishop's face hardened. "You're done, Cross." Jamal knew it before the words were even spoken. They weren't going to fight him anymore. They weren't going to arrest him. They were going to kill him. The fourth officer scrambled for his radio, calling for backup, for medics, for whatever they needed to make this look like something it wasn't. Jamal's breathing was ragged, his ribs on fire, his vision hazy, but he had no choice now. He had to go. He turned and ran. Gunshots rang out behind him, the sound splitting the air, echoing off the buildings. Something hot grazed his side, sending fresh pain ripping through his body. But he didn't stop. He forced his legs to move, pushing through the burning ache in his lungs, sprinting toward the alleyway between buildings. He had spent years memorizing every back street, every shortcut in this neighborhood. And now, those instincts were the only thing keeping him alive. More voices behind him, more shouting. He vaulted over a chain-link fence, hitting the ground hard on the other side. The pain nearly took him out, his body threatening to give in, but he forced himself forward, stumbling into the shadows. He wasn't out of danger, not even close, but he was still breathing. For now. And now, they would be coming for him. Jamal moved like a man running on instinct alone. His ribs were a mess, his body screaming with every step, and the gunshot wound on his side burned like someone had set fire to his flesh. Blood trickled beneath his shirt, sticky and warm, but he couldn't stop now. The alley was narrow, dark, the pavement slick with city grime, but it gave him just enough cover to slip between the buildings before the officers could regain their bearings. Behind him, sirens wailed, the distorted voices of dispatchers crackling through radios, barking orders. The entire block was waking up now. Lights flicking on, people stepping to their windows, some too afraid to look outside, others desperate to see what was happening. The police had control of the streets, but they didn't have control of him. Not yet. Jamal pressed his back against a dumpster, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, trying to steady himself. He had seconds, maybe less. If they followed the blood trail, if they got dogs, if they blocked off the roads, it was only a matter of time before he was cornered. His mind moved faster than his pain, calculating, shifting through options. He needed an out. His gaze flicked toward the squad cars parked on the street, their engines still running, their doors open in the officers' rush to pursue him. One of them was closer than the others, still idling, the driver's side empty. A few more feet, and he could get to it. But getting inside wasn't the hard part. getting out alive was. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to move. The alley opened into the street behind the squad cars, and Jamal stayed low, his steps deliberate, measured. The pain slowed him, but his training wouldn't let him stop. He reached the nearest squad car, his fingers curling around the door handle. He pulled it open, slipping inside before anyone turned their heads. The police radio crackled. Suspect headed north on 5th, armed and dangerous. Shoot on sight, if necessary. They weren't bringing him in, they were shutting him down. Jamal swallowed the taste of blood and forced himself to focus. The keys were still in the ignition. He twisted them, the engine humming beneath his fingertips. The weight of the car settling around him like a weapon waiting to be fired. A sharp noise made him freeze. The back door of the squad car was cracked open. Someone had thrown something inside in the chaos. Something small, barely noticeable beneath the folded-up rain gear and extra zip ties. His eyes scanned the seat, then locked onto a phone. Not just any phone. A police-issued encrypted device. His fingers curled around it, the cool surface slick with someone else's sweat. He knew what this was, what it could mean. This wasn't a burner. This was evidence. He didn't have time to process it. Jamal threw the car into gear just as the first officer turned. "Hey!" The shout barely registered before he hit the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, the force slamming him back against the seat. He kept his grip steady, weaving between parked cars, pushing the engine harder than the cruiser was probably built for. Gunshots cracked behind him, glass spiderwebbed across the back windshield. But he didn't slow down. His fingers found the police radio, his training kicking in faster than his exhaustion. He twisted the dial, changing the channel, tapping into their comms before dispatch could issue new orders. "Suspect spotted near 7th and Monroe," he said, keeping his voice short, authoritative. "Headed westbound. All units converge." For a second, there was silence. Then, the radio crackled to life. "Copy. Units diverting now." Jamal exhaled, his grip tightening on the wheel. They took the bait. He kept moving, cutting through a side street, avoiding the main roads, using the cruiser's own presence to slip through areas no one would question. The sirens behind him faded, redirected. The chase was moving away from him now, exactly how he needed it to. But he wasn't safe yet. His body was working on borrowed time, his vision flickering between sharp and hazy. He had to ditch the car before they realized their mistake. He needed to disappear. The docks. It was a long shot, but it was his best one. If he could get there before they rerouted, he could lose them in the maze of shipping containers, find a way to disappear before they even realized he was 2 steps ahead. His breath came uneven as he checked the rearview mirror. No one behind him yet. Good. He turned his focus to the phone in his lap, gripping it tighter. Grady's encrypted phone. Jamal didn't know what was on it yet, but the fact that it had been in the squad car, left behind in the chaos, meant one thing. Grady had been hiding something. And now, that something was in Jamal's hands. Jamal's fingers gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the stolen squad car through the back streets near the docks. His body was a mess of pain, his ribs tight and unrelenting with each breath, his side still seeping warm blood beneath his torn shirt. The adrenaline that had kept him moving was beginning to wear thin, and exhaustion was creeping into his bones. But he couldn't afford to slow down. He had made it this far, outmaneuvering men who wanted him dead. And now, he had something they never intended for him to have. Grady's encrypted phone. Jamal parked deep between 2 abandoned warehouses, far from streetlights or prying eyes. The stolen police car was still humming beneath him, its radio crackling with distant voices that were likely still searching for him. He reached for the knob, twisting the frequency, making sure to keep their comms open while they had no idea he was listening. The phone in his lap felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't a personal device. It wasn't something filled with texts about weekend plans or idle messages to friends. It was a tool of men who operated in the shadows, men who saw their badges as leverage rather than duty, a way to exploit the very people they had sworn to protect. Jamal powered it on and got to work. His fingers moved out of habit, bypassing standard encryption and overriding security measures that were meant to keep men like him out. This wasn't new to him. He had done this before in places far more hostile than this city, where the difference between getting the right information and failing meant someone didn't make it home. The screen flickered. Then it opened. His breath slowed as he scrolled, his mind racing as he took in the messages, lines of conversation, blunt and efficient, void of any concern beyond the business they conducted. These weren't casual conversations or back-alley deals. This was something bigger, something deeper, a network of transactions between men who saw human lives as nothing more than numbers. Then he saw Bishop's name. Jamal tapped the thread, his stomach tightening as the messages loaded. Shipment secured. Same deal as last time. Expect delivery Tuesday. Cleanse the block. Counts off. Handle it. Need another permit fast-tracked. Clients willing to pay extra. His fingers tightened around the phone. His pulse pounded against his skull as he scrolled further, each message confirming what he already suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. This wasn't just a handful of dirty cops taking bribes and shaking down businesses for extra cash. This was an entire operation. Bishop's unit wasn't just running a protection racket. They were selling weapons, moving firearms through the city like a well-oiled machine, distributing to the highest bidder, whether that was the cartel, private buyers, or criminals looking for unregistered firepower. They were fast-tracking gun permits for men who had no business carrying weapons, pushing through paperwork for wealthy clients who wanted access to firepower without the wait, making sure that money kept flowing into the right pockets. And they were robbing drug dealers under the cover of arrests, stripping entire operations clean and keeping the cash and product for themselves. The deeper he went, the worse it became. Jamal exhaled slowly, forcing himself to keep reading, forcing himself to take in every sickening detail. The police weren't just pocketing bribes and running guns. They were dismantling communities. The texts outlined a pattern, one that started with anonymous tips, ones that always seemed to lead to businesses owned by Black and Latino families. The officers would raid them, planting drugs, manufacturing charges, forcing owners into impossible situations. Fines would pile up, court fees, legal expenses. And when the businesses couldn't keep up, when the weight of false charges and harassment became too much, the owners were left with no choice but to sell at a fraction of what their property was worth. And when they did, the same buyers always seemed to be waiting. Jamal dug deeper, searching the messages for something more, something concrete. That was when he found a recurring name: Richter. It wasn't a cop. It wasn't a street name. It wasn't a cartel leader. It was something else. Jamal clicked the thread, his breath slowing as the latest exchange loaded. Keep everything clean. Richter doesn't want heat right now. Price just went up. He wants guarantees. No mistakes this time. Richter's watching. Jamal's jaw clenched, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just some low-level scheme being run by Bishop and his unit. This went beyond them. He scrolled further, shifting through hidden folders tucked away in the phone's encrypted storage. What he found made his stomach turn. Photos of city blocks, maps marked with red X, entire neighborhoods highlighted and outlined. Next to them were property values, before and after figures, listing the market price before an owner had been forced to sell, and the increased value once the land had changed hands. Names of business owners, addresses, all properties that had been foreclosed, seized, or forcibly sold after legal pressure had been applied. It was all here. A blueprint of systematic displacement, orchestrated under the guise of law enforcement. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears as he swiped through image after image. Some were surveillance shots, business owners arguing with officers outside their storefronts, men being handcuffed, women in tears as eviction notices were tacked onto their doors. Then came the financial records, bank statements, wire transfers, money being moved through shell companies, funneled into private accounts connected to political figures, real estate developers, and men like Richter. It wasn't random. It was calculated, and Grady had been keeping receipts. Jamal sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just corruption. This was a machine, a system built to exploit and erase entire communities, replacing them with high-rise buildings, expensive storefronts, and wealthy investors who didn't care about the people they had displaced. And Bishop's unit had been the enforcers. Jamal's grip tightened around the phone. The air in the squad car suddenly felt heavier, the weight of what he had just uncovered pressing against his chest. He had spent years in war zones, fighting against regimes that did this to their own people, watching as entire cities were emptied out by force. Now, it was happening here. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, the police still combing the streets, still searching for him. They weren't just looking for a fugitive anymore. They were hunting a man who had just stolen the one thing they never intended for anyone to see. Jamal pocketed the phone, his mind already racing through his next move. He couldn't just survive this. He had to expose them. He reached for the door handle, ignoring the pain in his ribs, ignoring the exhaustion pressing into his bones. The war had just begun. Jamal sat in the unmarked car, his body running on fumes, his side burning with each breath. The stolen squad car had been ditched miles back, abandoned in a place where it would take them hours to track down. He was out, for now. But this wasn't over. If anything, it was just getting started. The encrypted phone rested in his lap, its weight heavier than the device itself. Everything he had uncovered, Bishop's gun running, the fake drug busts, the extortion of small businesses, the deliberate erasure of entire communities, was in this phone. But it wasn't enough to just know. He had to act. He had one name, Richter, the man in the shadows, the one who pulled the strings. But he needed more. He needed proof. He needed someone who could help him use it. He reached for the police radio, flipping to a secured frequency he knew only one person would be listening to. "Reed," he said, keeping his voice level. "It's Cross. We need to talk." There was a long pause. Then, finally, the detective's voice crackled through the speaker. "Jesus Christ. Do you have any idea how much heat is on you right now?" "Yeah," Jamal said, glancing at the blood on his hands, at the stolen evidence in his lap. "That's why I called." Another pause. Jamal could hear the hesitation, the weight of a man standing on the edge of a decision. "Where?" Reed asked finally. Jamal gave him the location of an abandoned lot near the river, a place off the grid. He shut off the radio before waiting for a response. He knew Reed would come. 30 minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness, creeping along the cracked pavement before stopping a few yards away. Detective Reed stepped out first, cautious, scanning the shadows before settling his eyes on Jamal. The man looked older than Jamal remembered, lines deeper on his face, the wear of years spent fighting against a system that didn't want to be fixed. "You better have something worth this risk," Reed muttered, walking toward him. Jamal pulled out Grady's phone and tossed it to him. "Take a look." Reed caught it, his face unreadable as he scrolled. His shoulders stiffened the further he went. His fingers slowed. His breathing changed. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "This is real?" he asked, though his expression said he already knew the answer. Jamal nodded. "Real enough to get me killed." Reed let out a long breath, staring at the phone like it was something dangerous, because it was. Jesus. Jamal didn't need to press him. The detective had spent years watching corruption spread through the department like a disease. He had tried to fight it, had tried to stay clean while everything around him rotted. Now, he had undeniable proof that the men he worked with were criminals. "Your people won't help you with this," Jamal said. "You know that." Reed's silence was confirmation enough. After a long moment, he pulled out his own phone and made a call. "We need to meet," he said to whoever was on the other end. Jamal didn't ask who. He just got into the car. The meet was already set when they arrived. Jamal had heard of FBI agent Vaughn before. She had been digging into Bishop's unit for years, trying to bring them down, but never able to make anything stick. She had seen too many cases fall apart, too many witnesses disappear, too many good cops forced out while men like Bishop stayed in power. Now, she stood near a black SUV, arms crossed, her face hard, her posture sharp. She didn't look surprised to see Jamal. "Detective Reed tells me you've got something I should see," she said as they approached. Jamal handed her the phone without a word. Vaughn scrolled through the messages, her eyes narrowing with each line. She took her time, absorbing everything, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had been waiting for this exact kind of evidence. "This is good," she said finally. "Really good. But it's not enough." Jamal clenched his jaw. "Not enough? That phone ties them to gun running, extortion, real estate fraud. What else do you need?" Vaughn looked up, her expression calm but firm. "Names. Contracts. Something that ties Richter directly to these deals. A message saying, 'Burn the neighborhood down' won't get us a conviction. I need financials. I need proof of intent." Jamal exhaled, forcing himself to push down his frustration. He knew she was right. It wasn't enough to expose them. He had to bury them. Reed shifted beside him. "Then we need to talk to Maya." Jamal's brow furrowed. "Who?" Vaughn tapped her phone, pulling up a file. "Maya Cole. Owned a family diner on the east side. Her business was one of the first targeted when Bishop's unit started working with Richter's people." Jamal felt something settle in his chest, cold and sharp. He had been to Maya's diner before, had eaten there, had seen how much it meant to the people in that neighborhood. "Where is she now?" he asked. Vaughn's expression tightened. "Lost her business 3 months ago. She tried to fight it, but the city buried her in legal fees. When that didn't work, she started getting harassed. Random inspections, fines, even an arrest for disturbing the peace when she tried to protest." Jamal stared at the ground, his fists clenching at his sides. He knew exactly how it had gone down. They had pushed her to the breaking point, forced her to watch everything she had built get ripped away, until she had no choice but to let go. "And Richter?" he asked, his voice low. Reed spoke this time. "His company bought the property for pennies on the dollar 2 weeks later, the same way they've done with dozens of other businesses." Jamal felt his pulse thud against his temples. This wasn't just corruption. This wasn't just Bishop's greed or a few cops lining their pockets. This was a system, a machine designed to strip entire communities bare and sell them to the highest bidder. And Maya had proof. Vaughn met Jamal's gaze. She kept records. Every time she got fined, every time an officer showed up at her door. Bank statements, loan documents, even paperwork from other business owners who went through the same thing. If we can tie any of those properties directly to Richter, it's over. Jamal exhaled slowly, his vision clearer than it had been all night. This was bigger than him, bigger than Bishop. It was a war for the soul of his city. "You still with us, Cross?" Vaughn asked. Jamal met her gaze. "I'm not just with you," he said. "I'm finishing this." Jamal barely felt the pain in his ribs anymore. He had been running on adrenaline and discipline for so long that exhaustion was nothing more than a distant thought. His mind had locked onto one thing: the next move. He wasn't just running from Bishop's unit anymore. He was hunting them. The documents from Maya's records had confirmed everything. Bishop and his men weren't just extorting businesses for profit. They were dismantling entire communities, one forced sale at a time. The moment a small business owner refused to play by their rules, the pressure started. False fines, sudden inspections, harassment at every turn. If that didn't work, drugs were planted, charges appeared out of nowhere, and legal fees stacked up. When they couldn't keep up, they had no choice but to sell their properties for pennies on the dollar to Richter's company. Jamal had fought men like Richter before, powerful men who pretended to be clean while sending others to do their dirty work. He had seen this tactic play out in war zones, regimes using control and fear to seize land and wealth. erasing the people who stood in their way. Now, it was happening in his own backyard. And tonight, it ended. The warehouse on the outskirts of town was the key. Jamal had spent hours studying movement schedules, shipment logs, and financial records. This was the heart of their operation. Stolen weapons, cartel cash, seized drugs. Everything that funded Bishop's unit passed through here before disappearing into the system. This was where corrupt cops met the men they claimed to be fighting. They thought no one would come for them here. Jamal was about to show them how wrong they were. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the smell of motor oil, rusted steel, and dust. The dim glow of overhead lamps cast long shadows through the rows of stacked crates, turning the space into a maze of steel and concrete. Jamal moved with quiet precision, his steps careful, his breathing measured. He wasn't rushing, he was hunting. He had slipped in through a side entrance, an old maintenance door rusted at the hinges. Security was light. They weren't expecting trouble. Voices echoed from the far end of the warehouse. "Shipments coming in Friday. Richter already has the cash lined up," one of them said. Another voice responded. "Same accounts?" "No. Running it through the redevelopment fund this time. Bishop doesn't want anything linking back to him directly." Jamal's fingers tightened. That was it. Proof that city funds, money meant for the very people they were targeting, were being stolen and funneled straight into Richter's developments. He lifted his phone and silently snapped photos of the ledgers and paperwork laid out on a nearby table. A sound caught his attention. Footsteps. Someone was coming toward the office. Jamal moved quickly, shifting into the shadows. He stayed low, his breathing steady. The door swung open. Miller stepped inside. The officer scanned the room, eyes narrowing as he spotted the open desk drawer. His head turned just slightly, enough for him to see Jamal. For a brief second, neither man moved. Then Miller went for his gun. Jamal was already there. He grabbed the officer's wrist before the gun cleared the holster, twisting it hard. Miller grunted, trying to break free, but Jamal shifted his weight and drove a sharp elbow into his jaw. The officer's head snapped back, his grip loosening just enough for Jamal to wrench the weapon from his hand and toss it aside. Miller swung wildly, but Jamal ducked the strike and countered with a brutal knee to his ribs. The force of it sent the officer stumbling backward, his shoulder crashing into the filing cabinets. Jamal didn't let up. He closed the distance, grabbing the back of Miller's vest, twisting him and slamming him face first onto the desk. The wood rattled under the impact. Paperwork scattered across the floor. Miller groaned, trying to push himself up. Jamal pressed a forearm against the back of his neck, pinning him down. "Stay down." The officer struggled, but his strength was already leaving him. Jamal pulled a zip tie from the officer's belt and wrenched his arms behind his back, securing him tightly. Miller groaned in protest, but Jamal was already moving. His cover was blown. It was time to go loud. Jamal stepped out of the office, moving quickly between the stacked crates, his senses sharp. The men at the far end hadn't noticed him yet. Then a voice shouted, "What the? Who tied up Miller?" The entire room shifted. Jamal didn't wait. He grabbed the nearest crate and shoved it forward, sending a stack of metal pipes crashing onto the floor. The noise was deafening, echoing through the massive space. The officers whipped around. "Who's there?" Jamal moved. He covered the distance in 3 quick strides, slamming a fist into the closest man's jaw. The officer staggered, gun slipping from his grip. Jamal caught it mid-air and whipped it across his face. Another officer lunged. Jamal sidestepped, sweeping his leg out in a brutal arc. The man's feet left the ground, and he hit the floor hard, his head bouncing off the concrete. Shouts rang through the warehouse. "Take him down!" Jamal weaved between the crates, his movements sharp, fluid. He heard the thud of boots hitting the ground, the metallic click of safeties being flipped off. He grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it into the ribs of the next officer. The man let out a sharp grunt, stumbling sideways. Another charged from the left. Jamal ducked at the last second, twisting his body, using the officer's momentum against him. He caught the man's vest and drove him headfirst into a stack of crates. Gunfire erupted. Jamal dove behind cover, breathing steady despite the chaos. "Where's Bishop?" someone yelled. "On his way." Jamal exhaled slowly. Good. He wanted Bishop here. The officers moved carefully now, tightening their formation, trying to box him in. They thought they had the upper hand. They had no idea he was setting the trap. Jamal reached into his pocket, pulling out a small timed charge. He twisted the dial, setting the fuse, and placed it against the side of a gas canister. Boots thundered toward him as he crouched behind a stack of crates, listening to the men closing in. He waited until they were nearly in position, counting the steps, judging the angles. The second they moved into view, he fired. The gunshots cracked through the warehouse, sending two men stumbling back as their weapons fell from their hands. Before the others could react, he rolled to the side, grabbing another crate and shoving it into their path, forcing them to trip as they scrambled for cover. Then, behind them, the explosion erupted. Jamal felt the heat surge through the air, the force of the blast shaking the warehouse as smoke filled the space. It wouldn't kill them, but it would cause enough confusion to give him the edge. He moved through the haze, striking fast and hard, taking down anyone who stood between him and the exit. By the time the smoke began to clear, he was already gone. Jamal moved quickly, weaving through the smoke that still lingered from the explosion. His ears were still ringing from the blast, but he didn't stop. His movements were sharp and precise, his mind locked onto one goal: get the documents and get out before they regroup. The warehouse was alive with chaos. Men were shouting, some struggling to recover from the shockwave of the explosion, others scrambling to locate him through the thick haze. The sound of boots pounding against the concrete filled the air as more officers flooded into the space. Jamal knew he didn't have much time. He darted toward the office where he had first spotted the files, moving fast, keeping low. His ribs burned with every breath, but he ignored it. He had felt worse. He had fought through worse, and he wasn't stopping now. The door to the office was ajar, swaying slightly from the impact of the explosion. He slipped inside and immediately scanned the desk. Papers were scattered across the surface, some already partially singed from the heat of the blast. He flipped through them quickly, searching for anything that tied Richter directly to the operation. And then he found it, a ledger. It was thick, bound in worn leather, filled with meticulously logged transactions, dates, property seizures, bribe amounts, and names. Every forced eviction, every crooked deal, every payoff that had passed through Bishop's unit was accounted for. And at the bottom of each page, the same signature appeared again and again. Walter Richter. Jamal exhaled, his grip tightening on the book. This was it. This was what Vaughn needed. This was what would bring everything crashing down. A sound at the doorway snapped him back into focus. They had found him. He barely had time to react before the first man charged into the office, gun raised. Jamal moved instinctively, yanking the nearest object, a heavy stapler, from the desk and hurling it across the room. It smashed against the man's wrist with enough force to make his aim falter. The shot going wide and embedding into the drywall. Jamal was already moving. He closed the distance, grabbed the officer's arm, and twisted hard, forcing the gun from his grip. With a sharp strike to the throat, he sent the man reeling back, gasping for air. Another figure appeared in the doorway. Jamal didn't hesitate. He launched forward, using the first man's body as a shield as more gunfire erupted. The bullets thudded into his human cover before he shoved him aside and went for the second attacker. The officer swung wildly with the butt of his rifle. Jamal ducked, avoiding the strike, then drove his knee into the man's gut, followed by a brutal elbow to the jaw. The officer hit the ground hard, unconscious before he even landed. Shouts echoed through the hallway. More were coming. Jamal grabbed the ledger and shoved it into his jacket before sprinting toward the exit. The warehouse was a battlefield now. The explosion had set off a chain reaction. Crates had toppled, some areas were partially collapsed, and the officers inside were still trying to get their bearings. Some were firing blindly through the smoke, others barking orders at their men to flank the exits. Jamal moved fast, staying low, using the cover of debris and shadows. He had the documents. He just needed to get out. A burst of gunfire forced him to dive behind a stack of crates. He counted at least 5 men, all armed, sweeping through the warehouse floor. They weren't just trying to contain him anymore. They were trying to kill him. He needed a distraction. His eyes darted to a leaking fuel drum just a few feet away. The explosion had caused a small fire to spark nearby, flames licking at the spilled liquid. Jamal reached for his stolen pistol and fired one clean shot into the fuel. The fire ignited instantly. A column of flame roared upward, filling the warehouse with heat and light. The officers near it scrambled backward, momentarily disoriented by the sudden eruption. Jamal didn't waste the opening. He surged forward, sprinting toward the nearest exit, moving before they could recover. One officer spotted him and fired. Jamal felt the bullet tear past his arm, a searing flash of pain cutting through his focus. His grip faltered for half a second, but he forced himself to keep moving. Another officer rushed him, swinging a baton. Jamal sidestepped at the last second, catching the man's arm mid-swing and twisting it violently until he heard the sickening pop of a dislocated shoulder. The officer howled in agony as he dropped, clutching his arm. More men were coming. Jamal turned the corner, reaching the side of the warehouse where one of the emergency exits was still intact. His heart pounded in his chest. He was almost out. Then, a figure stepped into his path. It was one of Bishop's lieutenants, a broad-shouldered officer with years of street muscle, the kind of man who didn't need a badge to be dangerous. He had no gun in his hand, no hesitation in his stance. He had been waiting for this fight. Jamal exhaled slowly, his body instinctively shifting into position. The officer grinned. "You've caused a lot of problems tonight." Jamal didn't respond. The man lunged, throwing a powerful right hook, but Jamal saw it coming before he even moved. He sidestepped, letting the punch sail past him before driving his fist deep into the man's ribs. The officer grunted, but didn't stop. He came back fast, swinging again, this time aiming for Jamal's injured side. The pain flared through his ribs as the punch landed, but Jamal gritted his teeth and retaliated. He slammed his palm into the man's throat, forcing him to stumble back. Jamal followed up, pressing the advantage, throwing a sharp knee into the officer's stomach before grabbing the back of his head and driving it into the steel frame of the door. The man went limp. Jamal didn't waste time. He pushed through the exit and into the night, his legs still moving even as his body screamed in protest. Gunfire cracked behind him. He ducked low, darting through the alley beside the warehouse, weaving between dumpsters and abandoned vehicles. His car was parked 3 blocks away. He just had to make it there. The sounds of pursuit were close. More men spilling out of the warehouse, barking orders, searching for him. Jamal pressed forward, his breathing controlled, his mind focused. He had made it this far. He wasn't stopping now. His fingers clenched around the ledger inside his jacket. He had what he came for. Now, he just had to survive long enough to use it. Jamal sat in the front seat of the unmarked car, parked in a dimly lit alley a few miles from the warehouse. His body ached from the fight, his side still throbbing where the bullet had grazed him, but he ignored it. He had been through worse. Pain was temporary. The ledger tucked inside his jacket was what mattered. Reed sat in the driver's seat, silent as he flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. The dim glow of the dashboard lights cast sharp shadows over his face, making the weight of what he was reading even more pronounced. He didn't speak right away, taking in each transaction, each falsified report, each illegal seizure. Jamal could tell exactly when it hit him. Reed exhaled, a slow, heavy breath, his jaw tightening as he scanned the last few entries. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered. "We knew Richter had his hands in this, but this isn't just extortion. It's an entire system. The city's been handing him properties like clockwork, and Bishop's been making sure the right people lose their businesses. Jamal leaned back against the headrest, staring out at the empty street beyond the windshield. That's why it worked for so long. Nobody was looking in the right places. They made it look like business as usual. A few failed loans here, a few arrests there. It never seemed connected until you saw the whole picture. Reed shook his head, still flipping through the pages. Richter isn't just stealing property. He's flipping entire neighborhoods, gutting communities, making sure the only people left are the ones who can afford to live in the towers he builds on their bones. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding into his voice. How do you even fight something like this? Jamal reached across and tapped the ledger. You hit them where they can't recover. We leak this to the right people. Let the feds dig into Richter's books. Expose everything. He might think he's untouchable, but nobody survives when the government starts pulling apart their finances. Reed let out another slow breath, his grip tightening on the pages. If we go to the feds, we have to be ready for backlash. Bishop's not going to roll over. Neither is Richter. Jamal already knew that. He had spent enough time in war zones to understand how powerful men reacted when they were backed into a corner. They never surrendered. They burned everything down before they let someone else take them out. That's why we move fast, Jamal said. Get this into the right hands before they have a chance to bury it. Reed nodded, reaching for his phone. Vaughn's been waiting for something like this. She's already been circling Bishop's unit. If I hand this over now, she'll push for a federal task force to take them down. The moment this lands on her desk, it becomes official. No more cover-ups. No more buying their way out. Jamal glanced at him. How long? Reed dialed a number, holding the phone to his ear. You'll find out soon enough. Jamal listened as the detective gave Vaughn a quick summary of what they had. She didn't even hesitate. Within minutes, Reed hung up and turned the key in the ignition. They're moving on it, he said. FBI's about to put pressure on every single name in that ledger. Richter's office is going to be the first place they hit. Jamal exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the first blow had been landed. Richter wasn't going to be able to talk his way out of this. As Reed pulled out onto the street, Jamal kept his eyes on the darkened buildings around them, instinct warning him that the hardest part was still ahead. The black SUVs pulled up outside Richter's high-rise office just before sunrise. Federal agents stepped out in coordinated silence, their presence casting an unshakable weight over the block. They moved with efficiency, some heading toward the entrance, others securing the perimeter. The few security guards stationed at the front barely had time to react before their radios crackled with orders from inside. The FBI had arrived with a search warrant, and they weren't leaving empty-handed. A senior agent strode through the glass doors, flashing his badge at the receptionist. This office is now under federal jurisdiction. Step aside. Inside, the building was already awake. Executives in crisp suits stood frozen in the corridors. Assistants whispered frantically into phones, and high-ranking managers were already backing away toward the elevators. The agents didn't let them. "Nobody leaves," one of them announced. "All personnel will remain in their offices until further notice." More agents stormed through the space, splitting off into teams as they began seizing records, copying hard drives, and going through financial statements. It didn't take long before they found what they were looking for. The storage room on the 15th floor was locked, but it wasn't enough to stop them. Within minutes, a tech specialist had bypassed the security system, and the door swung open. Inside were rows of filing cabinets filled with financial reports, transaction receipts, and internal emails. This was where Richter had buried the skeletons, the paper trail of backdoor deals and fraudulent transactions. An agent pulled open the first drawer and scanned its contents. It was all there: bribes paid out to city officials, payments funneled through shell companies, signatures tying Richter to properties acquired through illegal seizures. Another agent pulled out a set of files, flipping through them with a low whistle. "This isn't just real estate fraud," he muttered. "This is a full-blown racketeering operation." Downstairs, in the main conference room, Richter had just arrived. His face was calm, his suit immaculate, But the tension in his jaw gave him away. He was calculating his next move. "I don't appreciate uninvited guests in my office," he said smoothly, folding his hands in front of him as he addressed the lead agent. "I hope you have a warrant for this disruption." The agent didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a document, unfolding it with deliberate ease before placing it on the table. "Signed by a federal judge," he said. "Everything in this building is now part of a federal investigation." Richter's lips barely twitched, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise. Jamal watched from across the street, his hood pulled up as he leaned against a lamppost, blending into the early morning pedestrians. He wasn't the kind of man who usually stayed behind to watch the fallout, but something about this felt different. Too easy. Reed stepped up beside him, hands in his pockets as he watched the FBI agents move in and out of the building. "It worked," he muttered. "Richter's done." Jamal didn't answer right away. His instincts had been trained over years of combat, over years of learning how to listen to the silence between the noise. And right now, something wasn't right. He kept his focus on the movement near the FBI vehicles, watching as agents loaded boxes of evidence into unmarked vans. It was too clean, too easy. "Richter was always careful," Jamal said after a moment. "Too careful. And Bishop's unit has been running this operation for years. If we got close enough to expose them, they knew we were coming." Reed frowned. "You think this was planned?" Jamal exhaled slowly. "I think Richter knew this was a possibility. And I think Bishop's already making his next move." As if on cue, Reed's phone buzzed. He glanced down, his expression shifting instantly as he read the message. Without saying a word, he handed it to Jamal. Jamal took the phone, scanning the short text from one of Reed's sources inside the department. "Bishop's unit is off the grid. No calls, no radio. They're moving." Jamal clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what that meant. Bishop wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was cleaning house. The raid had been the first strike, but the real fight was still coming. And Bishop was already one step ahead. Jamal sat at the edge of the safe house, staring at the city beyond the warehouse district. The tension in the air was thick, heavier than before. The FBI raid had been a success, but Bishop had gone quiet. Too quiet. There were no desperate moves, no scrambling to clean up the mess, no panicked attempts to cover their tracks. It was calculated, controlled. That was what worried him. Then the call came. Reed's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his brows furrowing. "It's Maya." Jamal's posture straightened instantly. Maya had been keeping a low profile since the investigation had started, helping Vaughn gather evidence, making sure the story got out. But now she was calling in the middle of the storm. Reed put the call on speaker. Her voice was tight, forced. "Reed, it's me. I need help." Jamal's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. "Where are you?" Reed asked immediately. I don't know. I was driving home and—" Her breath hitched, static breaking the line for a moment. "They grabbed me. I think it's them." Jamal didn't hesitate. "Who? Bishop?" A deep voice cut through the line, drowning out Maya's frantic breathing. "I was wondering how long it would take you to pick up, Cross." Jamal's jaw clenched as Bishop's voice filled the room. "I have to admit, you've been a thorn in my side. The kind that just won't go away no matter how much pressure I put on it. You took my operation, my leverage, my money, and now you think you've won." A slow chuckle followed. "But here's the thing, soldier. You and I both know this isn't over. So, let's settle it." Jamal's fingers tightened around the phone. "Where is she?" Bishop ignored the question. "You always were predictable, Cross. Always playing hero. I know exactly how this ends, but I'll give you a choice. Come alone, or I send her back to you in pieces." Jamal's pulse stayed steady, but his mind was already running through the possibilities. This was a trap. Bishop wouldn't just be waiting. He would have men, weapons, an entire kill zone set up. It didn't matter. "Send me the location," Jamal said, his voice level. Bishop chuckled again, low and confident. "See you soon." The call cut off. Reed exhaled sharply. This is a setup. You know that, right? Jamal slid his holster over his shoulder, securing his sidearm. Of course it is. Reed shook his head. You don't have to do this alone. We can call Vaughn. Get backup. No time, Jamal cut in. Maya doesn't have time for bureaucracy. Bishop won't wait. If I don't show, he'll kill her just to make a point. Reed swore under his breath. Then at least let me come with you. Jamal paused. Reed was a good cop, but he wasn't built for what was coming. This wasn't going to be an arrest. It was going to be a war. I need you to stay alive, Reed, Jamal said finally, because if I don't come back, someone has to finish this. Reed didn't like it, but he understood. Jamal grabbed his gear, checked his weapon, and walked out the door. The location Bishop sent was an abandoned train yard on the outskirts of the city. The perfect place for an ambush. No lights, no civilians, just rusting steel, empty boxcars, and silence. Jamal parked a block away and made his approach on foot, keeping to the shadows. He moved low, controlled, his senses sharp. Every muscle in his body was wound tight, ready for whatever was waiting. He spotted movement near one of the larger boxcars. Bishop stood in the center of the yard, calm, waiting. Maya was on her knees beside him, hands tied behind her back, a cloth gag over her mouth. Two of Bishop's men flanked her, both armed, standing just far enough apart that any sudden movement would put her at risk. Jamal kept moving, stepping out just enough for Bishop to see him. You came alone, Bishop mused, tilting his head slightly. I almost didn't believe you would. Jamal's expression didn't change. Let her go, Bishop smiled. You always want to do things the hard way, don't you? He nodded toward his men. One of them reached down, grabbing Maya by the arm and dragging her to her feet. Jamal saw it before it happened. The slight shift in the man's grip, the way he adjusted his stance. He was about to execute her. Jamal moved. He drew his weapon and fired before the man could react, the bullet tearing through his shoulder, sending him spinning. The other guard reacted too slowly. Jamal was already in motion, closing the distance, driving his fist into the second man's throat, before twisting his arm and snapping it clean. Maya hit the ground as her captor collapsed beside her, clutching his shoulder in agony. Bishop didn't flinch. Instead, he moved. Jamal barely had time to react before Bishop was on him, a knife flashing in the dim light. Jamal twisted at the last second, feeling the blade graze his ribs instead of burying itself deep. He countered immediately, grabbing Bishop's wrist and twisting hard, forcing the knife away before driving his knee into Bishop's side. Bishop grunted, but he was fast, faster than Jamal expected. He absorbed the hit and struck back, a vicious elbow crashing against the side of Jamal's head. The force sent Jamal stumbling, but he recovered quickly, stepping back and resetting his stance. Bishop smiled. Not bad, but you're slowing down, old man. Jamal rolled his shoulder, ignoring the sting. You talk too much. They moved at the same time. Bishop lunged again, but Jamal anticipated it, sidestepping and slamming his forearm into Bishop's knife hand, forcing it open. The blade clattered to the ground, but Bishop didn't pause. He threw a brutal punch, catching Jamal in the ribs. Jamal absorbed the pain and retaliated, driving a sharp kick to the side of Bishop's knee. The impact sent Bishop off balance just long enough for Jamal to seize the opening. He tackled him. They hit the ground hard, rolling over the dirt and gravel, each one trying to gain the upper hand. It was raw, brutal, no hesitation. Jamal caught Bishop's wrist as the man tried to grab another hidden blade, pinning his arm before delivering a punishing headbutt that cracked against Bishop's nose. Bishop snarled, blood streaming from his face. He lashed out, trying to break free, but Jamal kept him locked down. He forced Bishop's arm behind his back, twisting it painfully as he pressed a knee into the man's spine. Game's over, Jamal said, his voice steady. You lost. Bishop struggled, but Jamal tightened his hold. Maya was free now, pulling herself to her feet, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Bishop let out a low chuckle despite the pain. You really think this ends with me? Jamal didn't answer. He knew Bishop was right. The war wasn't over. Not yet. Jamal tightened his grip, and Bishop finally went still. Bishop wasn't finished. Jamal felt the shift in his muscles a second before it happened. The sudden tension, the sharp twist of his body, the sheer refusal to surrender. He tried to break free, his elbow driving back, slamming into Jamal's ribs with enough force to make him grunt in pain. Jamal didn't let go. He kept Bishop pinned, but his grip loosened just enough for Bishop to wrench an arm free. The man moved fast, shifting his weight, flipping their positions with brutal precision. Jamal hit the ground on his back, and Bishop was on top of him in an instant. A hard fist crashed against Jamal's jaw, snapping his head to the side. Bishop was heavier, stronger, a street fighter who knew how to use his weight to his advantage. He rained down another punch, then another, each one designed to break something. Bone, cartilage, whatever got in the way. Jamal's vision blurred for half a second. But he had been trained for this. He absorbed the pain, waiting for the right moment. Bishop pulled back for another strike, and Jamal surged upward, twisting his hips, using the momentum to flip them over. Now it was Jamal on top, his knee pressed into Bishop's chest, his elbow driving down hard into the man's sternum. Bishop wheezed, but he didn't stop fighting. His hands shot up, clawing at Jamal's face, his fingers searching for a weak spot, an opening. Jamal responded immediately, grabbing Bishop's wrist and twisting, not to break, but to control, to force him into a position he couldn't escape from. He pressed his forearm against Bishop's throat, applying just enough pressure to cut off some of his air without crushing his windpipe completely. It was a warning, a sign that this could end right now. But Bishop still smiled, blood dripping from his nose. "You think you've won?" he rasped. "You have no idea what's coming." Jamal didn't let himself react. Words were just words. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. Movement. One of Bishop's men, barely conscious but still holding onto a gun, raising it in their direction. Jamal acted on instinct. He rolled off Bishop just as the gun went off, the bullet tearing through the air where his head had been seconds before. Before the shooter could fire again, Jamal lunged forward, kicking the gun from his grip and stomping down on his wrist with enough force to snap bone. The man howled in pain, but Jamal wasn't paying attention anymore. Bishop had used the distraction to get to his feet. Jamal barely had time to turn before Bishop drove a steel-toed boot into his stomach. The impact sent Jamal stumbling backward, pain flaring through his already injured ribs. He caught himself against the side of an abandoned freight car, breathing hard. He had taken hits before, but this one cut deep. He could feel something inside shifting wrong, but he forced himself to stay upright. Bishop came at him again, fists raised. Jamal ducked the first punch, dodged the second, then countered with a brutal palm strike to Bishop's nose. The crack of cartilage echoed in the night, but Bishop barely reacted. He was running on adrenaline now, fueled by rage. Jamal went for a second hit, but Bishop caught his arm and used his momentum to spin him around. Then, pain exploded in Jamal's shoulder. Bishop had snatched a blade from his belt and buried it deep, twisting just enough to make it burn. Jamal gritted his teeth, refusing to let the pain take him down. He forced his body to move, grabbing Bishop's wrist, yanking the knife free and turning it against him. Bishop barely had time to react before Jamal drove his head forward, slamming it into Bishop's skull with enough force to daze him. Both men staggered back. Blood dripped from Jamal's shoulder, soaking his jacket, but he kept moving. He couldn't afford to stop now. Maya was still here. He turned his head just enough to see her. She had managed to crawl away, her hands now free, a phone clutched in her grip. She was calling for backup. Good. Jamal's attention snapped back to Bishop just in time to see him rushing forward again. This time, Jamal was ready. Bishop threw a wild punch, but Jamal slipped to the side, catching the arm and twisting it around. He locked Bishop's elbow, forcing him to bend, taking control of the fight again. Bishop snarled, struggling, but Jamal drove a vicious knee into his gut, then another, keeping him off balance. Then, with a final push, he sent Bishop crashing into the side of a rusted train car. The impact was enough to slow him down. Bishop groaned, his body sagging for just a second. That was all Jamal needed. He pressed forward, grabbing Bishop by the collar, slamming him back against the metal, pinning him there. For the first time, Bishop looked like he was starting to feel it. His breath came in ragged gasps, blood dripping down his face, his hands twitching at his sides. Jamal stared at him, his own breathing heavy, his body screaming from the fight. "This ends now," Jamal said, his voice low, steady. Bishop coughed, a weak chuckle slipping past his lips. "You really think that, don't you?" Jamal didn't answer. He knew how men like Bishop thought. They always had another plan, another play. But this time, there was nowhere left to run. From the distance, sirens echoed through the night. Maya had done her job. Bishop knew it too. His eyes flickered, searching for an escape. But Jamal tightened his grip, forcing him to stay exactly where he was. "You're done," Jamal said. "It's over." Bishop stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, his body sagged slightly, the tension in his muscles loosening. Resignation. Jamal knew that look. But he didn't let go. Not yet. Maya's voice broke the silence. "Jamal, they're coming." Jamal nodded slightly, but he kept his eyes on Bishop. Even now, even with everything that had happened, he still didn't trust the man enough to turn his back. He waited, listening as the sirens got closer, knowing that when they arrived, this would finally be over. Or at least, it should be. But Jamal had learned one thing in his time fighting people like Bishop. Nothing ever ended that easily. The sirens were getting closer, their distant wails threading through the night, echoing off the steel and concrete of the abandoned train yard. Jamal kept his grip firm on Bishop, pinning him against the rusted side of the boxcar. Feeling the exhaustion creeping into his muscles, his shoulder throbbed from the stab wound, every breath dragging fire through his ribs. But he didn't let up, not yet. Bishop wasn't done. Jamal could see it in his eyes, the flicker of calculation, the subtle way his fingers tensed like a man still looking for an opening, still searching for a way to turn the tables. Bishop was the type who would rather die fighting than be taken in like a common criminal. Jamal wasn't about to give him that chance. "You hear that?" Jamal muttered, nodding toward the flashing lights just starting to crest the horizon. "That's the sound of everything you built falling apart." Bishop let out a weak chuckle, blood staining his teeth as he smiled. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was hoarse, but the arrogance was still there, buried beneath the pain. "Richter might be done, but you don't know the kind of people you're dealing with, soldier. You think you've won? You're barely scratching the surface." Jamal tightened his grip on Bishop's collar, yanking him forward before slamming him back against the metal. The impact sent a dull clang echoing through the yard. "Maybe," Jamal admitted, "but I know one thing for sure. You're not walking away from this." Bishop exhaled, something like amusement flashing in his expression. He shifted slightly, testing Jamal's hold, but there was no give. "You always did play the hero," he muttered. "Always jumping into fights you don't understand. That's why you're gonna die here, Cross. You don't know when to let go." Jamal didn't blink. "Neither do you." Bishop smirked, the kind of smirk a man wears when he still thinks he has a chance. Then he moved. Jamal felt it the second Bishop shifted his weight, but the man was faster than expected, even after everything. He twisted hard, using Jamal's grip against him, slipping free just enough to drive a knee straight into Jamal's wounded side. Pain flared through Jamal's ribs like white-hot fire, his grip faltering for half a second. That was all Bishop needed. He shoved Jamal backward, hard. Jamal staggered, his boots skidding against the gravel, barely catching himself before Bishop came at him again. Jamal ducked the first swing, twisting away from the second. He retaliated immediately, slamming a fist into Bishop's ribs, twisting into the motion to maximize the force. Bishop grunted, but didn't slow. He struck back fast, landing a sharp hook against Jamal's jaw, snapping his head to the side. Jamal absorbed the hit, shaking it off, stepping in close to block the next attack before countering with a brutal elbow to Bishop's face. Blood sprayed from Bishop's nose, but the man didn't stop moving. They were both running on fumes now, bodies battered, lungs burning, instincts taking over where strategy had failed. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about who could outlast the other. Bishop lunged, aiming low, but Jamal saw it coming. He sidestepped, grabbing Bishop's arm mid-motion, twisting his body and using the man's momentum to flip him over his shoulder. Bishop crashed onto his back, the impact sending a shock wave through the gravel. Jamal was on him instantly, pinning him down with his knee, securing his wrists. There was no more fight left in him. Bishop gasped for breath, his face twisted in pain, his strength finally failing him. Jamal didn't move. He just watched him for a long moment, breathing hard, his body screaming at him to stop. "You should have stayed down when you had the chance," Jamal muttered. Bishop coughed, a weak laugh escaping his lips. "You really think locking me up is going to fix any of this?" His voice was hoarse, the fight finally draining from his body. "You think the people I work for don't have contingency plans? You think I don't?" Jamal didn't let his grip loosen. "I don't care what plans you had. It's over." Bishop let out another breathless chuckle, his gaze flickering toward the flashing red and blue lights now flooding the train yard. The FBI and local law enforcement had arrived, and this time they weren't working for him. The first agents on the scene swarmed the area with tactical precision, their weapons drawn as they moved in, securing every possible exit. Their movements were sharp, controlled. This wasn't just any arrest. This was a takedown they had been waiting for. Maya had backed away, her hands raised to show she wasn't a threat, but her eyes never left Jamal and Bishop. She didn't look afraid. She looked relieved. One of the lead agents stepped forward, his rifle aimed squarely at Jamal. "Step away from him. Now!" Jamal exhaled slowly. The fight was over. He lifted his hands, stepping back just enough for the agents to take control, dragging Bishop up, forcing his arms behind his back, locking the cuffs tight. Cole Bishop didn't resist. He just looked defeated. The agent nearest to him grabbed a fistful of his blood-stained shirt, yanking him upright. "You've been corrupt for a long time, Bishop, but the trail always leads home." Another officer tightened the cuffs, pressing a hand to his radio. "Subject in custody. I repeat, we have Sergeant Cole Bishop in custody." Jamal watched as the words left the agent's mouth. They didn't say corrupt officer, but they didn't need to. The weight behind the name said it all. Bishop had been protected for years, buried beneath bureaucratic red tape, insulated by a system that had let him thrive in the shadows. That protection was gone now. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was a criminal. One of the agents, an older man with a hard-weathered face, shook his head as he glanced at Bishop. "You made us chase you a long time," he muttered. "You think we weren't going to catch up?" Bishop barely reacted, though the smirk on his face hadn't completely faded. He turned his head slightly, looking at Jamal with something that almost resembled amusement. "You really think you changed anything?" he said, voice hoarse from the fight. Jamal didn't respond, but his silence only seemed to amuse Bishop more. "Come on, Cross," Bishop continued, shaking his head. "You should know better. There's always another. You cut off one head, another takes its place. This game is bigger than you, bigger than me. You're still fighting a war you can't win." Jamal's gaze didn't waver. "Doesn't mean I stop fighting," Bishop chuckled, a low, rasping sound. "Yeah, that's what makes you predictable." Jamal took a step forward, just enough to close the distance between them. "You're going to spend the rest of your life behind bars. And when the next one steps up, I'll put him there too." Bishop's smirk twitched, just slightly, before the agents pulled him toward the waiting SUVs. "Long time coming," one of them muttered, shoving him into the back seat. "You're done, Bishop." Bishop tilted his head slightly, giving Jamal one last glance. "I wouldn't be so sure about that." Jamal didn't blink. He wasn't listening anymore. Bishop wasn't in control. Not anymore. The system he built, the power he held, it was all crumbling beneath him. He could talk all he wanted, but it wouldn't change the fact that this time he had lost. Maya stepped up beside Jamal, keeping her voice low. "Are you okay?" Jamal rolled his shoulder, feeling the sting of his injuries. "I've been worse." She gave him a look. "That's not an answer." He smirked slightly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'll sleep better knowing he's not out there anymore." Maya exhaled, watching as Bishop was loaded into the back of the SUV. "Think he's right?" she asked. "Think there's more?" Jamal glanced at her, then back at the scene unfolding in front of them. The flashing lights, the federal agents, the weight of a battle that had finally ended. "There's always more," he admitted. "But this was the first step." Maya nodded, as if she already knew the answer before she asked. The weight of the night settled over them as the vehicle started to pull away, carrying Bishop toward whatever fate awaited him. Jamal took a slow breath, feeling the ache of every bruise, every wound. He had survived. And for now, that was enough. Jamal sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his hands resting on the metal table in front of him. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting harsh white light over the dull gray walls. Across from him sat Assistant U.S. Attorney Mitchell Carter, a man in a crisp suit with the kind of face that had spent years navigating the murky waters of government bureaucracy. He wasn't a cop, wasn't a fed, he was a fixer, a man whose job was to make problems disappear. Jamal had seen his kind before. Carter folded his hands neatly, studying Jamal with an expression that was equal parts business and mild amusement. "You know," he said finally, tapping a single sheet of paper on the table, "you should be facing some serious charges right now." Jamal didn't respond. Carter continued, his voice smooth, practiced. "Assaulting law enforcement officers, property destruction, weapons violations. I could keep going, but I think you get the point." He leaned forward slightly. "That kind of record doesn't go away easily. But," he slid the paper across the table, tapping it once, "I have an offer for you." Jamal glanced at the document but didn't reach for it. "You testify against Bishop and his men," Carter said, "and this all goes away. No charges, no prison. You walk out of here a free man." Jamal exhaled slowly. They wanted him to play their game. Bishop and his men were already in custody. But the real power, the politicians, the wealthy developers who had backed them, the ones who had made this system possible, they weren't touched. The FBI raid had uncovered plenty, but it wasn't enough to bring everyone down. Some of Bishop's backers had already started to distance themselves, covering their tracks, shifting blame. And now, they wanted Jamal to put the final nail in the coffin for the men who had already fallen, while letting the bigger players walk away untouched. Jamal finally spoke. "And what happens to the people above them?" Carter smiled like he had been expecting the question. "You know how this works. We take what we can get. Bishop's off the board, and his crew's looking at long sentences. That's a win." Jamal's jaw tightened. "And Richter? The politicians that let this happen?" Carter spread his hands. "Richter's going to fight this in court, and I don't need to tell you how well men like him do with the right legal team. As for the others, well, that's above my pay grade." Jamal let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "So, they get away with it." Carter tilted his head slightly. "They survive. That's how these things go." Jamal stared at him for a long moment. He could see the truth behind the polished words. This was how the machine worked. Bishop was a sacrifice, a piece removed from the board. But the game itself continued. If Jamal took the deal, he'd be another tool in the system, helping them close the book on a case that was far from over. He reached forward and picked up the document, scanning it briefly. The wording was clear. Immunity in exchange for his testimony. A clean slate. Then, without hesitation, he folded it in half, then again, creasing the paper with deliberate slowness before tearing it straight down the middle. Carter's expression flickered for the first time. "That's a mistake." Jamal met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "Not from where I'm sitting." Carter leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply through his nose. "You don't have many options, Cross." Jamal shrugged. "I don't need options." Carter studied him for a long moment, then let out a small, almost amused chuckle. "All right, I see where this is going." He pushed back his chair and stood, smoothing out his tie. "You do whatever you think you have to, but just know, if you're thinking about going public, you're gonna make some very powerful enemies." Jamal stood as well, rolling his shoulders despite the pain still lingering from the fight. "I already have." Carter gave him a lingering look before turning toward the door. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Jamal watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him. Then he pulled out his phone. The first leaks hit the press within the hour. At first, it was just whispers. Anonymous sources, snippets of internal documents, financial records linking developers to corrupt police units, names that hadn't been in the official reports. Then, it snowballed. By the next morning, news outlets were running full investigative reports, publishing emails, bank statements, recorded conversations that painted a picture far bigger than just Cole Bishop's operation. Jamal had handed everything over to the press. Every name in the ledger, every falsified police report, every connection between Bishop's unit and the people who had bankrolled them. The machine couldn't cover it up now. Government officials who had been silent during Bishop's arrest were suddenly scrambling, denying involvement. Politicians were distancing themselves. Real estate firms were issuing statements. Law enforcement agencies were forced to launch internal investigations. Carter had been right about one thing. Jamal had made powerful enemies. But he had also done something more important. He had forced the truth into the light. Maya watched the news unfold from the other side of the diner booth, her coffee growing cold in front of her. She glanced up at Jamal, shaking her head. "You really don't know how to lay low, do you?" Jamal took a slow sip of his drink, glancing at the TV above the counter. The screen showed a news anchor, reading off a new set of allegations against city officials. The words, "Corruption scandal widens," flashing across the bottom. "I tried that once," he muttered. "Didn't suit me." Maya smirked, but there was something serious in her expression as she leaned forward. "You know they're going to come after you for this." Jamal nodded. "Yeah, I know." She exhaled, shaking her head. "You could have walked away, taken the deal. Disappeared." Jamal met her gaze. "That's what they were counting on." Maya studied him for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. "Guess you really don't know when to quit." Jamal smirked slightly. "Guess not." Outside, the city was waking up, the streets humming with the weight of what had just been uncovered. For the first time in a long time, Jamal felt something close to peace. Not because the fight was over, but because this time they couldn't ignore it. The fallout from the leaked documents was swift and merciless. Cole Bishop and his entire unit were dismantled, their crimes laid bare before the public. The federal investigation ensured that every officer involved in his operation faced justice. Bishop was sentenced to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. His most loyal men, those who carried out the extortion and cover-ups, received decades-long sentences. The officers who cooperated were allowed plea deals, but none of them would ever wear a badge again. Walter Richter, once a real estate kingpin, fell just as hard. The evidence tied him directly to illegal property seizures, fraud, and racketeering. His financial empire collapsed under federal scrutiny, and his assets were seized. His conviction resulted in a 30-year prison sentence. Every corrupt transaction, every forced eviction, every bribe was dragged into the light, ensuring he would never wield power again. City officials who had protected Bishop and Richter weren't spared either. Some resigned before charges could be filed, hoping to disappear quietly. But public outrage made sure that didn't happen. Investigations continued, and many were indicted, their political careers ruined. The system had tried to protect them, but Jamal's decision to go public ensured there was nowhere left to hide. With the exposure of corruption, the police department underwent a massive overhaul. New leadership was forced to take over, and dozens of officers were either fired or reassigned. Federal oversight remained in place to prevent another bishop from rising in the ranks. The community rebuilt itself, stronger than before. The businesses that had been shut down reopened, this time with protections against predatory developers. The people no longer feared the police. Instead, they held them accountable. The city had tried to move on, but the people refused to forget. As for Jamal Cross, he walked away a free man. The government had considered pressing charges against him, but with the case exposed to the public, they had no leverage. He had done what the system failed to do. He brought down the people who preyed on the weak. There was no case to be made against him, no jury that would convict him. He reopened his store. Not because he had to, but because it was his. The battle had been fought, the war won, but walking away had never been an option. The liquor store wasn't just a business, it was a part of the community, a place where people gathered, where stories were shared, where a man could stand his ground and refuse to be pushed out. Jamal Cross had fought to keep his place, and now he would reclaim it. The day the new sign went up, people showed up. Not just for the store, but for what it represented. It wasn't about alcohol. It was about standing tall, about proving that no amount of corruption, threats, or violence could erase what they had built. The community had changed. The people had rebuilt everything Bishop and Richter had tried to destroy. Small businesses reopened, families moved back into the homes they had nearly lost, and the streets no longer carried the same weight of fear. The police department, once a tool of intimidation, now had watchful eyes on them. No one would be allowed to abuse their power again. Jamal never made speeches, never stood in front of cameras, never took credit for what had happened. But when people passed his store, they nodded to him, and that was enough. On the first day back, as he restocked the shelves, Maya leaned against the counter, watching him with an amused expression. So much for leaving it all behind. Jamal smirked. Figured I'd stick around. She chuckled, shaking her head. You know, people are still telling stories about you. Some think you ran off. Some think you're out there hunting down the next batch of bad guys. Jamal didn't look up from unpacking the latest shipment. You know what they say. Legends tend to take on a life of their own. Maya rolled her eyes. You're not a legend, Jamal. You're just a stubborn man who doesn't know when to quit. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze with a small grin. Same thing. The store was open again. The city had changed. Justice had been served. But the fight for a better future never truly ended. Jamal wasn't waiting for another war. He was right where he belonged. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends. And subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.